Okay, I'm doing another video. This one's basically for Trick because we've been going back and forth in the comments of the last video. And he wants me to look at the imposition argument a little bit differently. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here. Here we have the parent, the child, and the world. That says object. Object, or subject, object, object. So right now, and this is a little weight here on this machine. And right here we have the world, and we have suffering coming from the world, stemming from the world. And so what happens is this particular lineup between subject and object is flipped when over here we have the parent, because it's flipped upside down now, the parent suffering in the child. So we've flipped it, so now the child is the object, subject doesn't matter anymore, and subject is on the backside of the object sign here, so it comes up next to suffering. And the world still has the aspect of suffering in it. So the point of doing this illustration is to speak about imposition. The parent imposes suffering on the child is the antinatalist argument. Okay. And what I was doing before was saying the parent imposes the child upon the world. Now, the reason I say the imposition argument is dead is because in this case over here, the parent imposes the child upon the world. We put imposing right here, imposing, or imposes, or imposition right there. The child is the subject of the sentence, and it's being imposed upon the world. But the thing about the world is that the world is not sentient. So because the world is not sentient, you can't really impose upon the world, right? This is what I meant. I'm interchanging subject and object around the child because that seems to be the requirement of the antinatalist, is that they are both the subject and the object at the same time. So in this case, the parent imposes the child upon the world. You can't have a true imposition because the world is not sentient. The only two sentients are the child and the parent. So imposition doesn't work here. Now over here, the parent imposes, right here, suffering on the child. Now, the reason imposition doesn't work over here, even though the object is now sentient, is because the suffering, unlike in this case, well, still in this case, the suffering is an aspect of the world. So in order to impose, the parent can impose suffering upon the child, but the child first has to be there in order to have suffering imposed upon it. It would be like beating your child. So if you beat your child, you can impose suffering on the child. But since suffering is stemmed from the world, it's not stemmed from the parents, the real imposition would be right here. The imposition would be right here, in between the world. The world imposes suffering upon the child. But now that can't be a real imposition either, because the world is once again still not sentient. In order to have imposition, you have to have a consciousness that is imposing it upon another consciousness. A sentience imposing it upon another sentience. So in this case, the world cannot impose suffering upon the child. The parent cannot impose suffering upon the child unless the child is already there. So the act of coming into existence is not a proper imposition because the child's not already there. So this brings up the idea about whether or not you can levy debt to future generations. Is that real debt? I say, no, it's not real debt. Or you can empty toxic waste onto the planet, kind of like the nest, when Gary speaks about a shitty nest, right? You can dump this toxic waste onto the planet and then give birth to kids that have to grow up on that planet. Well, if the kids do suffer from that toxic waste, was it imposed upon them by somebody beforehand? And I want to say that the answer is both yes and no, but I argue mostly that it's no. And the reason why is because the world and life and language are all kind of equivalents. If we make the world and the parent the same thing, right? The world and the parent are kind of the same thing. They're existing together, and they're importing suffering onto the child, right? If we say that, then you kind of get a sense of where the antinatalist is coming from. And yet at the same time, if there is a world that exists that has parents and has toxic waste, and you still are able to live on that world, you don't realize that there's suffering. You may not even suffer due to that toxic waste. You may not suffer due to the parents, and you'll probably end up suffering something due to the world. Okay, and so because of that, my contention is that the perpetrators of whoever put the toxic waste there did not impose that upon the child. The child came into a world that already had that in it, like coming into a world that already has debt. It already has debt. It already has toxic waste, just like this world. And you will suffer. Suffering is an aspect of the world. So assuming that you're going to suffer at some point in your life stemming from the world, it doesn't mean that the cause of that suffering is the toxic waste. It doesn't mean that the cause of the suffering is the parents. It doesn't mean that the cause of that suffering is the person who made the toxic waste, or the cause of the suffering is the parent. It's that you are. Once you exist, once you're existing, then you're able to be imposed upon, right? So the parent can beat you when you're there because you're going to be in a neutral state. If the toxic waste of the world is going to make you suffer and you're born into that world, you already have a neutral state relative to that toxic waste. Like if you watch zombie picture shows, right? His argument is that pain and suffering stems from outside stimulus. It doesn't stem from inside stimulus. So as a child grows up in this world, whether or not it's a dirty world or a clean world, the imposition only occurs while the child is in existence. It only happens when somebody is acting upon you. Now, this is a hard one. It's a hard sell to say that because we're so conditioned to assume that debt goes down to future generations. But for example, you can't work more than you're capable of working. The debt is something that you personally didn't accrue, and so you're only going to be able to work so much, and it's said that you're paying off that debt, but you're already paying. You can only breathe in oxygen so many times. You can only bring in air so many times. And so whatever you do during that animated cycle, you could say you're paying off a previous debt. You could say you're paying off a debt that you accrued. And so I say that these are psychological elements. The psychological element is is that you were imposed upon prior to your being here. That's a psychological element. Meaning you grow into a psychology that allows you to believe that you are suffering the consequence of this debt. You grow into a world that has toxic waste, and as your proximity approaches that, you feel as if you're suffering. So you want to say, well, okay, so where could the imposition be if the person that is imposing toxic waste is already dead? So instead of a parent here, we have the person imposing toxic waste, right? And then you're the child. And the imposition for that would be down here, I would say, that they're gone. So you have the child and you have the world, and the world happens to have suffering in it because suffering is always an aspect of the world. So when you say that suffering is an aspect of the world, that could include scraping your knee, or it could include the toxic waste, right? And so if you want to blame somebody that came before you for a world that has already allowed you to be in it, then I say that that's a psychology. That's not a true cause and effect. Yeah, that's the argument there. It's not a true cause and effect, because you're already born into the world. It'd be almost as if you were made out of plutonium already, and you grew up in a world of toxic waste. It's not going to affect you or harm you, or maybe it will, but to the extent that you want to say that it came before you as opposed to you entered a world where it already was, are two different ideas. I don't know if that makes sense. We'll see.